Hey, everybody. Welcome to Histories of Horror. AL and I are thrilled to have a very special first time guest here on the show today. She's a gifted actress. I was just talking to her ahead of the show about how many wonderful things that she does as a creative. A singer, a songwriter. She has a very unique, beautiful voice. She's a celebrated author. There's just so much to talk about. I just wanna give a gigantic thank you to Tiffany Apan and welcome her to Histories of Horror today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, so another thing I want to before we get into this exciting interview with Tiffany is let you guys all know AL and I are both very excited to inform everyone. Are we not?
Yes, we are very excited for this.
So the big news is we got picked up with Midnight Realm Radio, so we will now be on their network every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I mean, every other Monday since we do bi-weekly episodes. And yeah, we just got that news at the start of this week, so it's very exciting to share it all with you today on the show. And moving back to our main person and the reason why we're all here. Tiffany, as a multi talented artist, you've explored different forms of storytelling through acting, music, and writing. What drives you to each of these mediums, and how do they inform one another?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So for me, they are kind of all intertwined and their own form of storytelling. So with acting, for instance, I'm part of the story and I'm telling the story basically from the point of view of whatever character I'm portraying. And I'm also telling the story along with, especially if it's like an ensemble production, along with a group of people. Of course, you have those occasional one man or one woman shows or whatever, but I've not done those yet. So, but never say never. But like say if I'm in like a theatrical production or like a film or something, it's like we're all telling the story, but as a collective, and each person from their own points of view, which I think is pretty fascinating and what can make for a good, well-rounded story. Now, as far as music goes, of course, the tradition of telling story through song goes way, 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 way back, probably to like the beginning of time, when the earliest humans were here doing like their chantings and their drummings, and it's actually a very, very beautiful like tribal experience and everything. But of course then as they built their instruments and everything, and each continent has its own instruments, and it can tell, like, especially when I do, like, traditional folk songs with, like, some of the, Celtic music groups, it's like I'm telling the story of, like, ancient Ireland and ancient Scotland and, the British Isles and sometimes even traditional songs from other parts of the world too. It's like I'm telling that particular culture's story, which, I think is just so, so cool. And then of course, when I write my own songs, I'm drawing from whether it's my own experience or whether something that inspired me from like a piece of art or some history. So I'm telling either my story or that particular story of whatever inspired me at that time. And then, of course, writing stories, the written word. That's also an ancient tradition too, but I also enjoy whether it's, telling a story through, like, just, like, as an orator or as a writer. I just enjoy just creating and creating different worlds and allowing people to even experience, the human experience through those stories, and that's a big theme of mine.
Really cool. So, with your upcoming release, Dreams of a Mad King, it sounds incredibly compelling. Can you tell us a little bit about the story and the inspiration behind it?
Absolutely, yes. So it's gonna be kind of like a dual release, like a song with a short story to go with it. Um, and it came from me writing my new album that I'm currently working on, which is based off of the Wars of the Roses, which was a very, very pivotal time in England during the 1400s. And, you had the House of York and the House of Lancaster. fighting with each other over the throne of England. And I've heard from several sources that that's actually where Game of Thrones actually got their inspiration, from the Wars of the Roses, and even with the House of the Dragon, that's actually inspired by Rhaenyra. The character Rhaenyra was actually inspired by Empress Matilda, who was basically the mother of the Plantagenets, the Plantagenet dynasty. Kind of like Rhaenyra was kind of like, she was like the mother of the Targaryen dynasty. So there's a lot of different inspirations there. And I was also, I decided to also choose a couple songs, 4 songs to do stripped down versions of, while I'm working on the full instrumentation versions of the songs for the album. And those songs I selected were Winter's King, they're all released except for Dreams of a Mad King. Winter's King, which is about Henry VII, and Rise of the Falcon, which is about Anne Boleyn, Lost Autumn, Richard III, and Dreams of a Mad King, which is about everybody's favorite, and I say that probably kind of sarcastically, Henry VIII. So, um, and really what the story behind that is Henry VIII at the end of his life, on his deathbed, and I kind of drew inspiration from the one of the scenes in the final season of The Tudors, where Henry, as like at the end of his life, he's revisited by the spirits of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour. And he's basically, and you can tell, and the actor who portrayed him, now Jonathan Rhys Meyers. I know that there were like people like, oh, he doesn't look like Henry VIII. Well, number one, VIII did not look like his most famous portrait his entire life. He was actually very personable and actually very handsome early in his years. So let's get that out of the way. But but the way the actor portrayed him, like he fully embodied, Henry VIII. And you can definitely tell, like when I was watching that scene in that final season of The Tudors, you can definitely see like Henry VIII kind of wrestling with himself, and just, on the one hand, yes, he's king. And at that time, they believed that the king was appointed by God and all that stuff. But his human self very likely felt, even if he tried to push it away, some type of guilt for the way he handled certain situations, for the way he treated people, mainly his wives, especially Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, and then Catherine Howard. And so in Dreams of a Mad King, he's reflecting on all of these things. And one of the descriptions in one of the verses actually came from kind of like this dream or this nightmare that Henry VIII had, like toward the end of his life in that last season of The Tudors. And I also drew from contemporary accounts, like of his, of his final years and everything. And the title I got from, it's kind of like a play on words, because Henry VI was actually known as the Mad King. And there were a whole slew of circumstances behind that, because, he came to the throne at like 9 months. I think it was like 9 months old or something crazy like that. And if the next in line, the next successor came to the throne as a minor, they had to have like somebody there, like as a regent or a lord protector, because obviously a child can't rule, so until young man would come of age, he would have like a regent or like a lord protector basically there handling everything until he was able to do it. Well, that would usually not turn out very well, because that's a lot for a child to handle. So Henry VI ended up not handling it very well, and he ended up going, as they said back in the day, going a little mad. And he and his wife, Margaret of Anjou, had to pretty much take on a lot of the responsibilities. And Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, actually came to the throne during very uncertain times, overthrowing Richard III. And Richard III died very brutally. And so Henry VII, especially after the death of, Elizabeth of York, who was kind of like the glue holding the House of York and the House of Lancaster together, when she passed away, um, Henry VII feared having Richard III's, fate, and then Henry VIII felt that it was his responsibility to carry on the Tudor dynasty, hence his obsession with having a male heir. So he feared not only having Henry VI, the Mad King's fate, but also Richard III's fate. So he has all these ranges of emotions going through him, and that's basically what I'm portraying in the song and a little bit more in detail in the short story that's going to accompany it. So
Wow.
that's my long-winded.
No, that was excellent. That was amazing. I was just
Yeah.
sitting here nodding in agreement, like, that
Mhm.
you were talking about with the Song of Fire and Ice and the House of Roses, and,
Mhm.
I just all ears. I'm totally fascinated, and I do agree. Jonathan Rhys Meyers, he is really amazing in
Yeah.
well, even though he seems obviously he's an incredibly handsome man.
Mhm.
He always has been, so there's that, but he's just an enigmatic actor, and so I think that
Yeah.
he hit that role perfectly.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I agree.
So your acting career includes roles in the horror genre and even historical reenactment, which I think are both absolutely awesome.
Yeah. Thanks.
How does that experience, particularly in capturing the tone and atmosphere of a different time or place, influence your creative work? And obviously, off of what you just said, it does a lot, I can
Yeah.
tell.
Oh, yes. Yeah, very much so. And I do like combining the historical aspect with, some of the creepy atmosphere aspect too, which I have done in, quite a few of, like, my work so far. Because to me, nothing is creepier than a period horror film, because there is just something about because when you think about it, you know, something that takes place, like, especially 100 plus years ago, or even a little bit less than that, but before everybody had cell phones, before everybody had GPS, you pretty much had to rely on yourself and, and like hope that those around you like weren't going to throw you under the bus basically if you were in a harrowing situation. So that is one thing that I do enjoy about, period horror films like, most recent like recently there was like Nosferatu and there's like also like quite a few of them where, I actually think in many ways they're even creepier than horror that takes place in modern times. And I actually kind of did a little something like this in my book Descent, where I did kind of like a story within a story where one of the main characters where the main character James Livingston, his son Lawrence Livingston becomes a writer of like paranormal and paranormal research and all of that stuff, and he writes a short story called The Child with the Black Eyes, you know, kind of like drawing from the phenomenon of black-eyed children with which people have been seeing sightings of them for like many, many, many years. And I mean, pretty much any of those like supernatural creatures. And I think especially even more so, centuries ago, because, again, they didn't have all the technology and the distractions that we have today. So if something weird appeared out of the ordinary, you were probably a lot more quick to notice it than you would, like, say, like somebody who, like, and I'm on my phone too, so it's like I'm guilty of this as well. But like somebody who's like just constantly on their phone and like not really noticing anything around them, although I do try to notice stuff around me. But but just case in point, I just think there's just something about like a horror or a mystery or a thriller that takes place like 100 plus years ago that just surpasses any like creep factor from today. Yeah.
So Tiffany, you've been very open about your own paranormal experiences. Has your personal history with the supernatural ever found its way into your writing? And if so, how?
Oh yeah. So I'm not saying which ones, which experiences. Who knows? Maybe one day I'll do like on my vlogging channel, I'll do a story time and reveal, okay, which paranormal experiences that I've had found its way into my works. But there are some paranormal experiences that my characters have experienced in some of my stories that were actually experiences that I had. So it does find its way into my writings, and like I said, I'm gonna kinda keep it under my hat for now which ones, but like I said, maybe one day I'll do a story time on my vlogging channel and reveal that, so
I'll be waiting to see that.
I'm sure now people will. They'll be like, "Hey," "which ones? Take
For
a guess."
sure. Yeah, I will definitely tune in for those because I love to hear about the
Yeah.
Yeah.
storyteller's paranormal stories. Many of your songs obviously tell vivid stories. Do you
Mhm.
see a connection between the narrative in your music and the storytelling in your novels?
Well, absolutely. Mainly, I love to paint pictures. I love to paint pictures with words. And I don't know, sometimes I might be a little bit too detailed, which means like sometimes like things have to get cut just because, we do live in a time where, a lot of people, there is a lot of people tend to have a shorter attention span than they did, years ago. So it's kind of like you have to find that happy medium.
Mhm.
Tell just enough to set the scene, create the atmosphere, draw people in, but not get so long-winded with it because I could I would probably do very well as a writer like 100 plus years ago because that's how they wrote. They wrote in like very vivid descriptions. So it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, you kind of have to keep, modern audiences in mind, and what they might be used to. But also, it's like to me, you don't want to lose that descriptive writing. You don't wanna lose, like, that atmosphere, and I do think that there's a movement of people kind of going back to that too, just wanting to read something that has atmosphere instead of just, "Okay, boom, 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 everything's done," you know? I do think Yeah, I do think that there's a movement of people going back to that, which is really good because, to me, like, telling a great story, like, you do wanna set a certain atmosphere. You do want to set the tone and, just set the tone of your characters and especially, even writing music, like I'm writing like my new album that I'm working on, it's based on historical people. So it's not only do I have to do research to respectfully tell their stories, but there's also a lot of filling in the blanks too. Like, okay, what might this person have been thinking about when they were going through this? And of course, nobody really knows what that person was thinking about except for that person. However, if you do like respectful research, you can possibly piece together, some educated guesses and kind of paint the picture from there. And that's the approach I'm taking to writing my new songs as well.
It's really cool. Writing high stakes fantasy can be intense. Do you find crafting dark action packed fiction more challenging than exploring character driven moments?
Yeah, I mean, it can be challenging, absolutely. But for me, I find focusing on the human experience helps me a lot, whether my characters are human or not, if that makes sense. So I do like to have my stories be even though I like to paint an atmosphere, I also like my stories to be very character driven. And that's where my stories tend to land, like, really kinda getting into, like, the characters' like, psyche and, just, some of their shadows and, any inner conflicts that they may have, and just being very character driven, and that actually, in a way I don't know about, you guys, but I know in a way that that does allow me to stay grounded in my writing is just really focusing on the character and the character's experience and their human experience too. Like I said, whether the characters are human or not, they still have feelings, they still have emotions that they're going through, and that's usually how I approach my stories. And I find that that does help me stay grounded in a high stakes scene because even if my characters are, like I'm writing like about like some magical like fairy who has all these powers, well, if that fairy knows how to do everything, then that kind of loses the tension in the story. Or even if it's like a human with some superhuman powers that they've discovered. Of course, they're not going to know how to do everything. They're going to have to learn how to use those powers because otherwise then, things might go a little haywire. So even with like some, like dealing with like characters that might have some like superhuman qualities to them, focusing on like the overall human experience and staying grounded in that also I think helps me stay grounding when writing a more realistic high stakes event as opposed to, oh yeah, everybody's all powerful and then just going kind of willy-nilly with that and, losing the overall essence of the story.
So, of all the characters in Dreams of a Mad King, which one has resonated with you the most or surprised you in how they develop?
Well, since that particular song centers around Henry VIII, I was actually kind of, like I said, like kind of pleased how just like with the angle that I ended up going with him. Because because I think if you talk to most people who are familiar with history, I would say that a good portion of them view Henry VIII as a villain, you know, and understandably so. However, even when I write, fictional villain characters, I try to find something about them that can be sympathetic. And I know that can be difficult, especially if the character is pretty vile. But, and even like going back to Jonathan Rhys Meyers and his portrayal of Henry VIII, he had some very human moments in there where you were actually kind of like, okay, yeah, maybe he's not a monster after all. But then he would go and do something really monstrous and everything. But that was one thing I liked about his performance was kind of like there's times when he had that back and forth and times when he would show that vulnerability and insecurity in his position as king. And even in my own stories when I write villains, I always try to find something that maybe can be sympathetic about them. And I mean, and even when I was taking acting classes, my acting teacher, I mean, that was like one of the places where I first heard that. And my one acting teacher, this one acting teacher I had, he's absolutely brilliant. Jeff Monahan, shout out to you. But what he said was, when you are portraying a villain, you can't portray them as somebody who knows that they're evil. You can't, and I think he cited Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Because in Silence of the Lambs, the thing about the way Hannibal Lecter is portrayed, he's very, very actually comes off as very grounded and very articulate and almost like he's in his right mind, even if he's not. I mean, if he would have played that as, like, oh yeah, look at me, I'm crazy, of course, it would not have been as effective. So, and in a way, he almost makes, in some weird kind of creepy way, he almost makes Hannibal Lecter somewhat likable, but that's kind of what you want when you're portraying a villain. And in a way, that actually makes that villain come off as even more evil, even though you're playing it from a perspective where, hey, I'm a sympathetic character, like this is why I do the things I do, I'm not evil. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do, like Henry VIII, I'm not evil. I'm just trying to like keep my throne secured and my father's legacy, et cetera, and yeah, maybe, and of course, the way he went about it. I mean, I don't like a lot of the stuff that he did. However, it was that just in general was a very brutal time as well. So it's kind of like, you look back at it, especially after he had his head injury and everything. It's almost like, could he have done it any differently, especially with the atmosphere and everything that was going on? So with things, just think with things like that in mind, and having to, just really kind of confront that and his own fears, and his fear of having the same fate of a Henry VI, the Mad King, end up having the same fate as Richard III. And then on top of that, his own father, Henry VII, was, very, very paranoid, especially in his final years. So he watched his father be very paranoid about, people overthrowing him and then, he watched his brother die and had all of this stuff. And it's just like, and yeah, like, the way he handled things, definitely very, what we would call inhumane and everything, but at the same time, it's just like, but then it's like you wonder again, it's like, could he have done anything differently and kept his place on the throne? Because, there were a lot of uprisings, but then at the same time, from a moral and human perspective, a lot of people suffered and, suffered very horribly under his rule. So in Dreams of a Mad King, it's like we're kind of like wrestling with those different themes and, okay, I had to do this, but could there have been a different way? Did I have to, put all of these people under like brutal torture the way I did? And am I going to be remembered as a mad king and as a tyrant and all that stuff? And it's really, capturing all of that and, almost having, your villain in a way confront themselves and confront their actions, especially at the end of their life when they're afraid of where they might go after they pass on.
That's very cool. You've had a successful acting career and now you're an author. How has the experience as an actor influenced your writing, particularly in crafting dialogue and character art?
I would say, my goal is to take people on a journey, you know, and I hope that, my hope is always that maybe they learn a little something about, the human experience, about, and even like a little bit about themselves. So anytime I go to whether it's like an acting role or whether it's I'm writing a song or whether I am, you know, doing something like, writing a story or for me, the human experience is most important. And, when people maybe taking a look at themselves and maybe learning a little something about themselves and how they approach the world.
So, looking back at your career, what do you think has stayed consistent in your storytelling voice?
I'd say creation of atmosphere and focusing on, like I said, the human experience is always a constant with me. And I love to create a good atmosphere because to me that sets the tone of the story. But I also like to really like focus on, you know, human psychology and even the dark triads when I'm writing my villains and everything. And really focusing on, telling these people's story, whether it's, the protagonist or the antagonist, and perhaps seeing if people can, like I said, you know, maybe find out a little something about themselves. And also, I another theme I like is somebody coming through dark times and, coming out on the other end. And even if I'm writing a series, I still like to kind of wrap each book up, where it's kind of like, okay, things are okay at least for now, so, coming through dark times, like, and seeing that light at the end of the tunnel is also a theme with me as well.
What advice would you give to writers who want to explore fantasy, particularly with moral complex characters and high stakes worlds?
So, I would say making the experience of the characters the focal point, at least that's something that's worked for me. I would also say study human behavior, especially when creating villains, because sometimes it can be a little too easy to create these like cookie cutter villains that, are just all, they're just all bad. It's just and sometimes they can come off as a little cliche. And for some stories that may work. But especially if you like say for instance, Lord of the Rings. What I really like about that is that you kind of get to see the kind of like the relationship between Saruman and Gandalf. And it was, so that was one thing, and to me, like, just kind of seeing that and how they knew each other, and then, that to me, that kind of like humanized like Saruman a little bit. So, even though they're magical creatures. So, I would say, yeah, definitely make your characters and their experience as the focal point. Draw a little bit from your experience too, just because, I mean, that's what I do. I draw a little bit from my own life experience. I also, draw inspiration from some actual historical characters that lived at one time. And I'll take that inspiration and put it into, like a new character that I'm writing. And I also, like I said, I like to study human behavior, human psychology, especially the dark triad, when I'm creating my villains and everything, and what could possibly, cause things like, narcissism, sociopathy, psychopathy, and, what could possibly bring a person to that tipping point. And for me, writing compelling villains is even more important than writing a compelling protagonist because like I said, sometimes, a lot of the time we tend to just write sometimes like we tend to write our villains like very cookie cutter with, with really no actual human qualities. And like I said, for some stories that can absolutely work. But even on the protagonist side, you don't want them. I know the term is like a Mary Sue or like, if it's a guy, a Gary Stu character, where they're just so perfect, they always know what to do. For instance, when I wrote my character, Dorothy Blake in A Descent, I did not want her to be this character who always knew what to do and what to say and was absolutely perfect. I wanted her to have like these character flaws. Like sometimes she has knee jerk reaction to things, and sometimes, she might let her emotions like, kind of get away from her and everything. But overall, she's still a very grounded person, but there's still like those human qualities that, and then like as things start to happen, she's just as baffled as, by what's going on as everybody else is around her. It's like, it's not like she's like this Nancy Drew character, like, oh, I know what to do. So even with protagonists, you want to be very, very careful to not make them too perfect. And maybe even throw in a morally gray character as well. Like, going back to Descent, my character Nikolai, who's, you know, it's very understandable as to why he ends up being the way he is. I mean, he's a Romani slave who, in Wallachia, and he and his youngest brother, like they were all each other had, and they ran away from their owners and everything. And then we get to see some of his journey, and he ends up being a very kind of morally gray character. Like he wants to do the right thing, but then his trauma, and of course he lived in a time where, mental health and everything wasn't really a thing or talked about. So of course he held everything in. And, while he wanted to do the right thing, it was just, he was constantly at war with himself. So, even like, with morally gray characters, that aren't completely good or completely bad, but they kind of dance between that fine line of becoming a good person or falling into their own darkness. And with that, I always say, study human behavior, get the story of that character that you're writing down. Because some of the characters I write, I have whole backstories behind them that sometimes don't even make it into the actual story, but because I know what happened, what happened to them, I could still write them in a pretty well-rounded way. Um, so I would say make the characters and the story and human behavior the focal point to stay grounded in a fantasy world basically. And make it, so that people can relate to those characters and, maybe, like I said, find something out about themselves. Yeah,
Yeah, I totally agree. The message that came through, I think, with most of this is just make them personable.
yeah.
So it was really awesome, Tiffany. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your journey and your artistry with us. To everyone listening, make sure you get your copy of Rings of a Mad King when it releases. I'm sure you're not going to want to miss this. What do you think, AL?
I can't wait to get my own copy now.
Woohoo! Yes. Well, thank you guys so much. It was really great talking with you.
Same to you, and I hope that you have a great weekend. Thank you for stopping by to chat with us.
Yes,
Yes. Have a
thank
great
you.
weekend too. Thank you.
Thank you.